Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking into something quite specific. Pre-industrial European textile guilds.
Yes, and it's a fascinating area. We often think of them simply as associations of artisans.
Right, like weavers or dyers getting together. But they were much more complex than that, weren't they? Real systems of power.
Absolutely. They controlled who could work, how, what got made, involving everyone from spinners and weavers to tailors, dyers, even merchants.
And there's kind of paradox there, isn't there? They aim to protect their members in the craft.
But in doing so, they often limited opportunities for others and maybe even held back broader economic growth.
Exactly. So our mission today is really to unpack how power worked inside these, quite closed systems and how that preserved privilege.
Let's dive in. A good starting point is how they regulated labor itself.
Okay, so that famous hierarchy, master, journeyman, apprentice, how did that actually function?
Well, you start at the bottom as an apprentice, usually young, bound to a master for, say, 5 to 9 years, learning the trade.
Receiving training, room, board, but no actual wages usually.
Generally, no. Then you had the journeymen. These were skilled workers, finished their apprenticeship, but not yet masters themselves. They worked for wages, often moving around.
Gaining experience, perhaps?
Precisely. And then at the top, the masters. They owned the workshops, employed others, sold the goods. That was the goal.
So the idea was this clear path. Apprentice, journeyman, master, an equal chance for everyone who entered.
That was the theory, yes. Standardized procedures were meant to ensure that. But the reality, well, it was often quite different.
How so? Was that progression actually common?
Not always. Becoming a master could be incredibly difficult. The existing masters often deliberately limited the number of new masterships.
To protect their own turf, essentially.
Exactly. Keep competition down, maintain their status and income, which of course limited social mobility for everyone else and kept economic power concentrated.
Let's go back to the apprenticeships. You said 5 to 9 years. That seems long.
It was a major commitment. And while the ideal was skill transmission, preserving the craft, it was also a source of very cheap, sometimes essentially free, labor for the master.
So, potentially exploitative.
It could be. Sometimes apprenticeships even required big upfront payments. And often, spots were saved for the master's relatives. Nepotism was definitely a factor.
Reinforcing privilege right from the start.
Yes. And we know that many didn't even finish. Something like 40% non-completion rates in places like London and Bristol in the late 1600s. High rates elsewhere, too.
Yeah.
Lyon, Leiden, Amsterdam.
Wow, 40%. That suggests the conditions might have been pretty harsh, or the prospects not seen as worth it.
It points to the difficulty, certainly. The system wasn't necessarily working smoothly for everyone involved.
Did the guilds step in if things went wrong? Like if an apprentice wanted out or a master wasn't teaching properly?
They did play a role in enforcing the contracts. If a master died, for instance, or wasn't fulfilling their side, the guild might find the apprentice a new master.
Okay, so some protection there.
But they also tried to stop apprentices leaving early. The master had invested time, and expected to get that labor back. It solidified the master's control.
Right. So after apprenticeship, assuming you finished, you became a journeyman. Skilled, but still working for someone else. What was life like for them?
Often it was a state of sort of perpetual subordination. With masterships being so limited, many journeymen knew they'd likely be wage laborers for their whole careers.
That must have been frustrating. How did they respond?
They started forming their own associations. You see things like the Compagnonnages in France or the Gelengenschaften in German areas.
Like early trade unions.
In a way, yes. They provided mutual aid help if you were sick, burial funds, support when traveling for work, what they called tramping. But they also tried to protect their economic interests.
Pushing back against the masters?
Exactly. They argued for better wages, fairer working hours, protested against masters using cheaper, unapprenticed labor, and generally tried to improve conditions.
And how did the main master-dominated guilds react to that?
Oh, with hostility, usually. Conflicts was pretty common. Journeymen might go on strike or protest.
But they often got shut down.
Yes, frequently suppressed. Both the guilds and the city authorities tended to see these journeymen's groups as, disruptive, a threat to the established order.
It sounds like the guilds had immense control over the labor market. Did they act together to keep wages down?
Very much so. They often functioned as employers' cartels, really. what economists call a monopsony, a dominant buyer of labor.
How do they do that specifically?
Well, they'd set maximum wage rates. They might forbid masters from hiring workers who'd left another master. They'd regulate how many apprentices or journeymen a single master could even employ.
Limiting the labor supply.
And demand. Plus, they controlled who was even considered skilled. They had narrow definitions, required the completion of a masterpiece, a qualifying piece of work. This limited the pool of qualified workers, keeping wages in check and protecting the value of the existing master's status.
Okay, so tight control over labor. What about the market for the goods themselves? Did guilds control prices and production too?
Oh, absolutely. That was another major function. They were essentially cartels on the selling side too, aiming to maximize income for their members.
How? What kind of rules did they impose?
All sorts. Setting standards for thread quality, yes, but also setting minimum prices for finished cloth. Restricting how many looms a master could have, how much raw material they could buy, even how many workers they could employ. It was all about controlling supply.
Which sounds like it could stifle innovation, couldn't it, if everyone's focused on maintaining the current system?
That's a really important point. There was often significant resistance to new technologies or more efficient production methods.
Why? Wouldn't that make things cheaper or better?
It might, but it could also disrupt the existing order. New methods might devalue the skills of current masters or allow for much higher output, which could drive down prices. Guilds prioritize stability and protecting the investments, the skills, the workshops of their current members.
So it wasn't necessarily a dynamic, forward-looking environment.
Generally not. The emphasis was on standardized production, traditional methods. It created an inertia, a resistance to potentially disruptive change.
Now, guilds always talked about maintaining quality standards. Was that purely for the consumer's benefit?
That was the stated aim, yes. Setting rules for materials, techniques, the finished product weight, width, dye fastness, things like that. And they had enforcement mechanisms. Inspections, the masterpiece requirement you mentioned, guild seals or marks on goods.
Like a guarantee of quality.
Supposedly.
Mm.
But those same standards could also function as, well, barriers. Ways to exclude non-members or cheaper goods produced outside the guild's control.
Ah, so defining quality in a way that only guild members could meet.
Or in a way that made competing products seem inferior, even if they were perfectly functional. It limited consumer choice and kept prices high. It's a bit ambiguous quality control, yes, but also a competitive barrier.
Did everyone agree on how effective this was?
No, there's debate. Some research, particularly on English guilds, suggests they might not have had sweeping power to just ban goods based on quality claims alone. But defining quality could also be a strategy to appeal to elite consumers who valued specific, traditional standards.
Okay, so quality control is complex. What about getting the raw materials in the first place? Wool, flax, dyes. Did guilds control that too?
They certainly tried. Securing a reliable, affordable supply of raw materials was crucial. So they might engage in collective purchasing or set up exclusive deals with suppliers.
Squeezing out independent artisans.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
And they aimed to control who could even enter the market to buy those raw materials. Plus, they often had legal monopolies within their city or for specific types of textiles.
Did the merchants who traded textiles have a role here?
A huge role, and it varied. In places like Florence, powerful merchant guilds sometimes dominated the craft guilds, like the weavers. Elsewhere, say in Flanders or Brabant, the craft guilds might have held more power relative to merchants. It was a complex relationship.
We've mostly talked about guilds in cities, but lots of textiles, especially later on, were made in the countryside, right? How did urban guilds deal with that?
That became a major source of tension, especially from the 16th to 18th centuries. You saw the rise of this rural cottage industry, often organized through the putting out system.
Where merchants would provide raw materials to rural families to process at home.
Exactly. And this rural production usually had lower labor costs and fewer regulations. It was direct competition.
So the urban guilds weren't happy.
Not at all. They saw it as a fundamental threat. They lobbied governments hard for protectionist laws to suppress this rural competition.
Did they try to enforce their rules outside the city?
They did. They try inspections, confiscating goods made illegally in the countryside, impose fines, take legal action. Think of the York weavers trying to enforce their monopoly, or controls in Cologne.
But it must have been hard to police the entire countryside.
Extremely difficult. Enforcement was patchy, and a large, unregulated black market for textiles, plus things like the secondhand clothing trade, always persisted. It showed the limits of their control.
It's really clear how guilds work to protect their members' interests. Let's talk more about who got excluded. What were the main barriers to entry?
There were layers of exclusion. Often you needed to be a citizen of the town or have lived there a long time. That immediately disadvantaged migrants.
Okay, local preference. What else?
Kinship. Nepotism was rampant. It was much easier to get an apprenticeship or become a master if you were related to an existing master. Sons often paid lower fees, for example.
Just being born into it gave you a huge advantage.
A massive one. Then there was religion and ethnicity. The Jewish people were almost universally barred across Europe. Other minority groups faced discrimination too. It severely limited their ways to make a living.
And economic barriers. Was it expensive?
Hugely expensive sometimes. Apprenticeship fees, and especially the fees to become a master, could equal a whole year's wages for a laborer. That priced out the poor immediately. Some guilds even required you to own property.
So wealth was a prerequisite, not just skill.
Often, yes. And finally, there were these vague criteria like needing a good reputation or legitimate birth or not having engaged in dishonorable work.
Which sounds like a catch-all for masters to just reject anyone they didn't like.
Exactly. It gave them enormous subjective power to maintain the guild as an elite, closed group.
So guild membership really functioned like an inherited privilege in many cases.
Very much so. If you were from a guild family, you had the connections, the inside knowledge, often the financial backing. It smoothed the path immensely.
Did guilds foster a sense of community among members?
Definitely. They built social capital through meetings, rituals, participating in civic events or religious festivals together. Guild halls were social hubs. Intermarriage within guild families was common too.
Strengthening those internal bonds.
Yes, creating a strong us versus them mentality. And they provided mutual support, financial aid for members in need, help with funeral costs, sometimes care for widows and orphans.
But that support system only worked if you were in them.
Precisely. For those inside, it offered community, identity, security. For those outside, it just deepened the divisions, denied them those benefits, and reinforced the existing social hierarchy.
Let's focus specifically on gender now. We've touched on women being excluded, but how systematic was it in textiles?
It was deeply systematic. Across most of Europe, women were explicitly banned from apprenticeships in the core high-status trades like weaving. Becoming a master was almost entirely off-limits.
Even working as a journeyman.
Often restricted or prohibited too. We see rules against hiring women wage workers in guild workshops. This happened even as women were doing vital textile work, especially spinning, but usually outside the formal guild structure. Sometimes, the rise of male guilds actually eroded roles women previously held.
Were there any ways for women to participate formally?
Very few, and usually quite restricted. A widow might be allowed to continue her husband's business for a while.
But that wasn't really about her own agency.
More about continuity for the business, and often came with limits like she couldn't remarry and keep the business or couldn't take on new apprentices. Then you had some all-female guilds.
Really? Where?
In Paris for silk makers, in France for seamstresses, some German cities had guilds for female spinners or silk weavers.
Did they have the same power as male guilds?
Generally, no. They often had less autonomy, fewer legal rights, lower status. And they were usually confined to trades already seen as feminine, which reinforced the gender divide rather than challenging it.
Can you give some examples of women's experiences in specific industries?
Sure. Paris silk, as mentioned, some opportunities, but women were concentrated in lower-paid tasks, and the female guilds were less powerful. French seamstresses did get independent guilds, which was significant, giving them legal standing for making women's clothes. But they were constantly fighting with male tailors over who could make what.
What about England?
In England, spinning wool and linen was overwhelmingly women's work, but low-paid and done through the putting-out system, outside guilds. The powerful weaving guilds, they largely kept women out.
And elsewhere? Florence? The Low Countries?
In Florence's wool industry, women were a big part of the workforce, but in low-ranking jobs like spinning. Seeing a widow in charge was rare. In Flanders and the Low Countries, women's roles in skilled production seemed to have declined as strong male guilds rose, pushing women into preparatory, lower-paid work.
So even when women were working, sometimes doing skilled tasks, their status and pay were lower.
Consistently lower, yes. This was rooted in broader patriarchal ideas and legal limitations on women's independence, like the concept of femme couverte, where a married woman's legal identity was subsumed under her husband's.
Were there any exceptions, any routes to independence?
A few. London had the femme sole status, allowing some women, usually widows or unmarried women, to trade independently. Some French guilds had recognized guild mistresses, but many women found their main opportunities in the informal economy, unregulated spinning, selling secondhand clothes.
So they showed agency where they could.
Absolutely, by dominating certain sectors, forming guilds where possible, finding niches. But the system consistently undervalued work primarily done by women, which was key to maintaining that gender hierarchy.
It's striking how interconnected all these exclusion mechanisms were. How did the guilds maintain this power structure for so long? What was their link to political authorities?
It was really a symbiotic relationship. Guilds lobbied and often paid rulers and city councils for privileges, charters granting monopolies, rights to regulate trade, etc.
And what did the authorities get out of it?
Revenue, for one. Taxes, fees from the guilds, fines they collected, sometimes even loans. Guilds could also provide services, like helping maintain public order, sometimes even contributing to city defense, and political support, of course.
A mutually beneficial arrangement for the elites, then?
Very much so. Guild members got protection and privilege. Political elites got revenue and stability, often at the expense of consumers, non-guild workers, and potential innovators. This idea of rent capture elites, structuring the economy to benefit themselves, is key here.
Did this very much across Europe?
Yes, the level of direct political influence guilds had varied. In some Italian or German city-states, they might be directly involved in governance. In larger kingdoms or merchant-dominated republics, their influence might be less direct, more through lobbying. But generally, they acted as a conservative force, protecting established interests.
With all that concentrated power, was corruption an issue? Nepotism, we've mentioned.
Nepotism was definitely systemic. And where you have closed systems with limited oversight, the potential for other abuses, embezzlement, bribery, misusing authority is certainly there. It's hard to quantify, but likely happened.
Did they always uphold their own rules, like on quality?
Not necessarily, especially if it clashed with the interests of powerful members. There are records of complaints about, say, poor enforcement of sealing procedures on textiles, suggesting private benefit sometimes trumped public duty.
And how did they enforce their rules against outsiders or dissenters?
They actively police their trades, as we discussed, trying to stop unregulated rural work or unlicensed city artisans through inspections, confiscations, fines, legal action. And they cracked down hard on internal dissent, like journeyman organizing, often with state backing. Think of the combination acts later on.
But they weren't always successful.
No, their enforcement had limits. They really struggled to stamp out rural industry or the informal economy completely. The black market for textiles, the secondhand trade, these were resilient. It showed their gatekeeping wasn't absolute.
Despite this power, were people criticizing guilds before the big changes of the Industrial Revolution, say, before 1750?
Oh yes, criticisms weren't just an Enlightenment phenomenon. Early political economists were already arguing that guild monopolies restricted trade, pushed up prices, and discouraged innovation.
Concerns about them being resistant to new ideas.
Exactly. And complaints that they didn't always maintain the quality they claimed to, or that enforcement was self-serving.
What about the people directly affected? Journeymen, excluded workers?
They voiced their discontent very clearly. Journeymen protested low wages and blocked advancement, formed their associations, went on strike. Excluded artisans and rural producers clashed with urban monopolies, petitioned for the freedom to trade.
And consumers.
You can infer consumer dissatisfaction from the thriving informal markets. People sought out cheaper, non-guild goods when they could. There were general complaints, too, about how restrictive entry policies limited people's ability to earn a living. Resistance took many forms, showing that guild authority was contested.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, what are the main takeaways about these pre-industrial textile guilds? What's their most significant legacy?
I think the core takeaway is that they were deeply entrenched systems of power and privilege, maintained through controlling labor, regulating markets, erecting social and gender barriers, and forging political alliances.
And their lasting impact.
It's significant. They shaped labor relations for centuries, defining skills, controlling access. They influenced economic structures, concentrated wealth, and arguably slowing innovation. And they profoundly affected social structures, reinforcing inherited privilege and excluding huge parts of the population.
It sounds like their legacy goes far beyond just passing down craft skills.
I'd argue that yes, Perhaps their primary legacy isn't skill transmission, but the institutionalization of exclusion itself. You could almost see the loom in this context, not just as a tool of production, but as a kind of border checkpoint, with the guilds acting as the gatekeepers.
That's a powerful image to end on, the loom as a border checkpoint. Thank you for walking us through that complex world.
My pleasure. It's a history with echoes, I think.
Indeed. For everyone listening, we hope this look at guild power and exclusion has given you food for thought. We encourage you to explore more about pre-industrial economies and how these dynamics of power and exclusion play out both historically and maybe even today.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.